Hi everyone! So in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a grey dapple horse in pastels. Now the first thing that I did for this portrait was a little different to others. Once I'd got that background in, I started then working with the bright highlight on the side of the face. Here, that's when I'm now going to start working with my dark values of the eye. The reason being, the reference photo that I'm using here had a beautiful backlit lighting, so that meant that one side and around certain areas of this horse had a really bright edge. So I wanted to make sure that that highlight did not get contaminated with any of the darker greys that I'll be using within that horse. So I wanted to make sure that that highlight remained really pure and bright. And the reason why I did the highlight first and then I worked on the dark pupil and the areas of the eyelid with those darker tones is again because I didn't want those dark pencils to be mixing with that highlight if I were to have added the highlight second. So it's really important here to think of which section needs to be worked on first. Now in most cases, as you've seen from all of my other tutorials here, I would always do the eye first, but for this I had to prioritise my bright white highlight. So jumping into the fur and hair sections of this horse, what I decided to do for this tutorial was just work with my pastel pencils. If you've seen many of my other tutorials here on YouTube, you'll know that I really do like working with my pan pastels for my first base layer. But for my Patreon tutorials, I do like to cover as many different techniques as I can, so I wanted to have a horse tutorial there where I am just using the pastel pencils for the horse itself. I did use my pan pastels for my background because the colours there and how vibrant they are was perfect for the effect that I wanted for this piece. But as you'll see as we go through this, I'm working just with my pastel pencils. So when it comes to the layering of the pencils, this is something where not having soft pastel sticks or pan pastels really does teach us how to layer the pencils to get those colours or those tonal values that we can see in our reference photo. I think it does teach us an awful lot on how to use the pencils as effectively as we can. And in the real-time tutorial on Patreon, I really do go in depth in how to mix specific pencil layers to create what we can see in that reference photograph. I also have a giraffe tutorial on Patreon. I'll link that in the description below because I do have a YouTube version as well. And there I show how to select your specific colours. Obviously with this we're working more with our grey, so it's more about the values and whether or not it's a warm grey or a cool grey that we need. But in terms of using browns, reds, oranges and so on, that can become a little bit more complex. So I created a giraffe tutorial where it does focus on a specific technique that I use to simplify the entire colour selection process. So as I say, if that's of interest, I will link that giraffe tutorial below. Now when it comes to the forelock, look at how many variations of tonal values I'm putting in for my base layer. I haven't started with one solid layer, I'm paying really close attention to those lights and darks. Now you do keep seeing a colour wheel come into view there, and that's because where I've recorded this with a voiceover while I'm drawing, I'm explaining all of my colour selection choices at the time. As I say, it's a really easy method and I do use a colour wheel, but it's not complex colour theory, it's very, very simple and it makes that process so much easier and stress-free. Now when I work with areas on a portrait, I will always work in small sections. So I have got my base layer for the forelock here in place, but I needed to get this other ear in so that I could then overlap those fine hairs of the forelock over the ear where needed. Now something that you do want to do is study that reference photo closely and think, is there any sections of the hair that overlaps another part next to it? If that's a yes, then you need to draw what's beneath that hair first, because otherwise we're going to be making the different levels of the hair that are technically overlapping look like they're at the same layer. So that therefore would mean that your portrait potentially might look flatter when finished. So you do want to make sure that we're paying really close attention to what is on top and what is beneath. So before I jumped into my details, I wanted to start working on the eye and work on the hair around the eye. Going back to what I've just mentioned, some of the hair here between the eyes will be underneath that forelock. So as that forelock comes to the end and the strands start to separate, those hairs are going to have to be layered over the top of the face hair details. so I had to make sure that I got this section completed first. Now when it comes to using your pastel pencils for your base layers, my aim is exactly the same as if I were to be using soft pastel sticks or pan pastels. You can see that I'm getting my base layers, my values, the transitions between lights and darks, nice and smooth and well blended. You can also see that I'm not using any soft tools or any blending applicators here, I'm just using the pencils themselves. Now this is a really good way, again, of becoming confident with layering your pastel pencils. We don't have to worry about what pan pastel or what soft pastel sticks we should be using, because one thing that can complicate that process is if you're using 3 or 4 different colours and you pick up more of one colour, the colour that you create is going to be different. It's exactly the same as when using paints. Whereas with just using the pencils, you are narrowing down that complexity because you can specifically pick which pencil you want, and you can then adjust the pressure you apply to that pencil, which will then only apply a certain amount of that pigment. So it's a little bit easier to control how much of that colour is applied to your paper. So I have a video here on YouTube and it's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in pastels. I'll link that below if that's of interest. Now a few things that I talk about in that video are fur length, fur direction and fur thickness. Now because there were a few textures here, like the softness in the ears, those tiny little hairs, the long hairs within the forelock area, which I'm just starting to add now, and those tiny fine details on the face, I did want to make sure that I uploaded every single part of this in real time, so no section was sped up, no parts are cut out. It's a really good tutorial to follow along to. But I wanted to make sure that I covered all of the pencil technique, because how we use those pencils, right down to how long the lead should be, how sharp it should be, where we should be holding that on the pencil, the amount of pressure that we should be applying to that pencil. All of these things I can really explain at that time of drawing, because it's something that can really affect the type of detail that we're trying to recreate. Now the way that I'm using my pencil here with those really long details is very different to how I draw short fur. And a question that I'm asked frequently on social media or here on YouTube is, how do I get my details so fine? So this is something that I really did want to make sure I focused on, along with all of the other important aspects such as contrast and layers in that Patreon tutorial. So if this is of interest, as I said, I will link my Patreon in the description below. I do also have a Patreon library on my website which lists all of the tutorials that are available on my Patreon as soon as you sign up. Now the wonderful thing with Patreon is you can stay for as long as you want, or you can cancel at any time. It's really flexible. So before I move on to the details on the rest of the face, if this video has been useful so far, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. And I upload 2 to 3 videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, don't forget to hit that subscribe and the bell button. So going back to the 3 things that I've briefly mentioned with pencil technique, so fur length, fur direction and fur thickness. Now the fur direction here you can really see is starting to come into play when we start working on larger areas of the face. Horses have quite a lot of changes underneath the skin, so they'll have little veins, bits of cartilage, the cheekbones, their structure, because their skin is quite thin, the hair is short, we're going to be able to see all of those little bumps underneath the skin. So we do want to be making sure that that fur direction is accurate. Now what happens is that fur direction follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So if we don't get that right, we will change the proportions of that animal's face, which means it won't resemble as much like that pet as it should. So any change in fur direction is really important to capture. Now in terms of the fur length, this is going to be decided by how long those pencil strokes are. So again, just as like the fur direction, this is really important. If I make my pencil strokes too long here, I'm going to make this horse look like a longer coated horse, or potentially that it's in winter with its longer coat. So we do have to be making sure that we are studying how long each of our pencil strokes should be. Now in terms of the thickness of those pencil strokes, that's going to be decided by a couple of things. One will be the sharpness and point of your lead. The other will be the pressure you're applying to the lead, and also how you're using that pencil. Where on the barrel are you holding that? All of these things are going to come into consideration, and it is something that's going to be very dependent on the texture that you're drawing. Now, regardless of that texture that I'm drawing, I will always work in small sections. You'll see that here and all of my other tutorials on YouTube, I will work on 2 or 3 square inches at one time. The reason being is I find that I personally therefore will not rush any section of my portrait. I'll give it the time that each section requires. Now, it also enables me to, let's say I decided to finish that drawing session here and I wanted to then carry on the following day. This already looks like that reference photo, it's already resembling that horse. I could easily then just leave it as it is, knowing that I've already achieved a good level of photorealism. This makes me more motivated to carry on and pick up the pencils the following day. If I work with more individual set layers, I think we stay in that ugly stage for a little bit too long, and that in itself can make it a bit disheartening. So I personally want to avoid that, and that's why I like working in small sections. Now, that being said, of course, that doesn't mean that that's how it should be. We're all going to find our own way of working and what works for each artist. But if ever you do find yourself becoming overwhelmed by the process, or maybe you spend more time looking at your reference photo thinking, where should I be drawing? That's usually a good indication that you're working on an area that's too large. Really narrow that down, break it up into manageable chunks, and you'll find that you'll be probably more productive with the way that you're working. So when it comes to working on any noses, it's really important, I think, to just focus on the abstract shapes. Noses like hands or fingers can get really complicated if we start to overanalyze the reference photo. What I want to do here is just focus on my lights and my darks and the shapes that they are creating. You can see that I'm mapping in my main darker creases, the nostrils, the darker line that separates the top lip from the bottom lip, and then I can work on these sections in between. If I break it down into these manageable chunks, it becomes far easier to tackle. Now, I'm also making sure here that I'm getting my contrast right. So in order to make this nose look realistic, I've got my shadows really dark, so the inside of the nostrils is as dark as I can get it, and then the highlights on the left side of that face again are nice and bright. The highlight on the side of the face is extreme in this case, as I mentioned at the beginning of the tutorial, just because it does have that strong backlit lighting. If I had lighting that was more front on, or maybe more from the right hand side but in front of that subject, you would have a lot more highlights on the right hand side of the nose. So really do study the reference photo that you're working on, because where we position the highlights and shadows will again affect the proportions of that animal's face. So just like the fur direction, the shadows and highlights, their placement will follow that underlying bone and muscular structure. So I mentioned that this tutorial was requested by a Patreon member, and they wanted me to create a tutorial showing how to draw dapple markings. So the neck and chest part of this tutorial is going to focus on that, and everything here is all about the values. You'll notice that I'm moving my pencil to follow that fur direction, fur thickness and fur length, but ultimately here it's my values that I'm really paying attention to. I'm making sure that I've got a dark enough base foundation so that when I then build my subtle layers on top, they are providing as much depth as they can. So here is a prime example. I'm using a mixture of light greys, but I have a darker base layer in place to build from. If you're using a pencil that you feel is confident in terms of how light it should be, but it isn't showing up, that's a good indication that the base layer underneath is not dark enough. So you want to go ahead and make that darker, and then the pencils that you have been using that haven't been showing up quite so well should now be more visible. Now, my biggest tip when drawing dapple markings is you don't want them to look like polka dots. So look here how I'm starting to make sure that I'm layering my lighter layers on top, but that the edges are soft. You've got a few hairs that overlap the dark areas around each of those lighter dapple markings, but there are no harsh edges. They should not look like neat circles, and you also don't want them looking like Dalmatian spots. Now, I'm actually going to plan a Dalmatian tutorial because I think that would make for a really interesting video. But even with Dalmatian spots, they are not circles, there are no harsh edges. But with dapple markings, I do find it's a little bit more of a softer look. So here again, although there are no real obvious dapple markings, I'm avoiding any harsh edges. When you're working with such good contrast here, it's really important to make sure that you put in your subtle layers. So again, this area here is a prime example. I'm starting off with a dark base foundation, I'm using my mid-tone greys first, and then I'm adding my lighter layers from there. I never just add in 1 or 2 layers. You want to be working with multiple layers and building up the depth gradually as you go. So I really do hope that this tutorial has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. And if you would like to draw along to this real-time tutorial on Patreon, then I will link that in the description below. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube in the next few days. And as always, thank you so much for watching.